Okay, welcome everyone. It's time to start our first class on church history. And as our brother Steve has mentioned, I'm excited about this. I've kind of been waiting to do this um, for months and been preparing for this, I want to say, for a couple of years for sure. The more I've gotten into it and the deeper I've gotten, the more I have felt blessed because I've studied church history. And the handout that I did last week, I talked about us being surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. And the Hebrew writer was specifically referring to people in the Old Testament. But it struck me as I'm reading that story didn't end. If you go to the last book of the Bible, Revelation, it doesn't end, say, the end. That was not the end. And the book of Acts, which is probably the best history book that we have, does the same thing. It doesn't say the end. In fact, it just stops in the middle of the story. And the reason is because the story goes on. So I've got a slide presentation here. For those of you that are listening elsewhere, we are monitoring. I have Jeremy monitoring the live chat. And so if you've got a question, you got a comment, please feel free to do that. And just a couple of housekeeping things that we're going to do. One is that you're not going to see it online, but we have a parking lot over here, and whenever I get down a rabbit hole, we may just say, that's a rabbit hole, and I need to go on that. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So as we go through this thing, here's some of the other logistics. And by the way, for those of you who know what that means, it's from a French word, from logistique, all right? And it means to put in the proper place. And so we're going to talk about putting things in the proper place. First of all, we are live, and we're going to be live not every Sunday, because next week we're not going to have a class. But then after that, we will continue on through September. And then in October, we're taking an extended trip to Japan and Cambodia. And so we're going to take a break in there, and then we'll come back up and hit November and part of December through that. And if you saw the schedule, you'll see all those. And then Wednesdays, the plan right now is to repeat this same class at Opportunity Central in conjunction with what's going on with the youth group. And so, but we got to look at that because we've kind of changed the plan since we had made that decision to do that. And I have a feeling that most people will either attend it with a live stream or in person here, and then others may watch it on video, and we may not need to do it on Wednesday. So we're going to kind of monitor that and see if we need to do that. In Texas, we have two groups that meet. We have a group in Forney that meets, and I can't tell you where they're meeting, but I do know that they meet in Forney. And then in the south, we have way down south is Crandall. For those of you that are online that don't live here, we live in Heath. Forney's about 7 or 8 miles south of here. That's where our church is, where our church currently meets. And then further south, about another 10 miles or whatever, is Crandall. And so we're kind of spread out. And so we meet Sunday nights typically in these small groups. And then if you can also see it live streaming at YouTube on newriverchurchforney.com. I know I sent a message out and invited several of my friends and people that I know. And so hopefully you made it on live. If you didn't and you're recording, or you're going to watch your recording, then that's good too, because it's going to be recorded and it's going to be on YouTube. And it is same thing, New River Church Forney, and it has basically all of our sermons and everything going back for like 5 years on there. And this will be part of that mix. It may be a little harder to find on that, but that's where it's going to be. And then the Church Center app that we use, I will be putting resources on there. And I've already put a couple in there. One is the PowerPoint presentation that'll have even this slide on there. And the other is some documents and then links. And so I put a link on there, and Steve picked up on it right away. If you subscribe to that, it'll tell you there's a new resource, and you can go check it out. The link that I put on there is earlychristianwritings.org, and some guy put together a fantastic resource. It is not for the faint of heart to go through there. But if we talk about something and we're doing our church history class, then what you want to do is you can look in there, you can say, okay, let's see where that document is. And there will be, a lot of the stuff was originally penned in Greek or Latin. And so those documents in there will be translations into English. And unfortunately, a lot of the translations are into King James English, which makes no sense to me, but there's also some other ones, and then there's commentaries, and you can go on and on. If you are watching on Netflix or Prime or something, every now and then something's going to come on, it's going to say, here's the lost books of the Bible. And Dan Brown in particular, who is not a friend of the church, he really did some things, and tried to disparage the Bible. And he talks about these lost books and things like that. And Tom Hanks in the movies and things like that went to look for all these lost things. And we found them, and it's on this earlychristianwritings.org. And so if you want to go see them, you can see what they're really talking about and don't have to trust those guys. All right. Now, here's the real question: is why study church history? And if I were just doing a class and it was just this people, I would talk about what do you expect to get out of church history. And I kind of take questions, and I've asked a lot of people, and I asked our group that's meeting here tonight, how many of you have ever taken a class in church history? And I kind of get some of this and maybe one, and because nobody studies this. Because first of all, nobody studies history, all right? But we study the Bible. And if you look at the Bible, what is it other than history? It's more than that. I'm going to tell you that it's more than just history. It's just not a history book. It's the inspired Word of God, all right? But beyond that, God has spoken throughout the ages to people. And I think he still does that. And what God will do, and I'm not saying they're inspired, but I'm saying that there are things that happen that you listen to and hear and read that are from God. I'll pick on Nate because Nate's over here. I said to Nate something about last week when he gave his sermon, did an excellent job in his sermon, and I said something to him. He said it was from God. It wasn't Nate. And I believe that 100%. Doesn't mean it's inspired and we got to, create a document and defend it and everything like that. But he was speaking because he's speaking from the Spirit and he's speaking about the Word of God. And we heard another lesson this morning. And if you attended church someplace, you hear that. And the reason is because these people are in touch with the Word of God, and we're in the middle of that. So hopefully we're going to learn some stuff. History a lot of times can be about, faces and times and dates and places, and we'll talk about some of that. But I want to talk about some of the discoveries of the whys. And my daughter-in-law, Angela, will say, why is it that we do what we do? Why were we taught that? And that's good questions. And you can find that in the pages of church history. In other words, why do we believe what we believe? Because I will tell you, there is a wide variety of beliefs about lots of different things. Some of it will be theology, and some of it's going to be practice and about what you do in terms of church service. Because our church service looks a lot different than a Roman Catholic church service, and it looks way, way different than an Orthodox service, a Greek Orthodox. And so we're going to kind of get into some of that. And then why do we observe what we observe? So why do we observe communion? Why do we observe any of these things like that we do? There are certain things we do that, and why do we do that? And so I want to discover some of the whys. If you have questions on some of those, please ask them, and I'll try to make sure we cover that. But some of it's going to happen because we are going to kind of go through this from a time standpoint, but that's what we're going to do. Another one is I want to be challenged. And I'll tell you that my study over this last couple of years, I've been challenged. I've been challenged in what I think. I've been challenged in what I believe. I've been challenged in some of the things that I was taught. And that's a good thing. All right? Doesn't mean everything I was taught was right. And it doesn't mean everything I believed was right. And in fact, I'll tell you right now, my theology is still wrong. And so is yours. If it was right, you would have something different to do. But everybody has wrong theology someplace. And here's the thing. Theology doesn't save you. Only the grace of God and Jesus Christ saves you. All right? And you can have a different viewpoint and you can have a different belief and be okay. All right? So that's one of the things that I want to make sure is that we're challenged and you're challenged and you examine some of the things that you may have. And I hope it would grow in your faith. Just like we talked about this thing with a great cloud of witnesses. At the end of that, in Hebrews 11, the next one, he says, therefore, since we're doing that, let's throw off what entangles us. And you start talking about, you're talking about people in history that had things that they were tangled up in. And yet they still held on to Jesus Christ. And we'll talk about people that suffered. We're going to talking about people that had bad intents, and we'll just kind of go on and on with that. Hopefully not too much on and on. I want you to be encouraged, and hopefully we'll get some of that in as well. Church history is not to validate what you believe. It's not to look back in history and say, I knew it. I knew everybody believed just like me. It's not to do that. If you're looking for validation in there, you're going to be terribly disappointed, because I could look at a character from the first couple of centuries, a guy named Athanasius. And I could say, well, Athanasius taught this thing, and that's exactly what we believe. And so, okay, thanks. And so because of that, because the Athanasius believed, it says, we're right all along. Well, don't look for that in church history. One, you didn't live where Athanasius lived. You weren't faced with the same challenges. You didn't know the same people he did. You live in today, and today is the days that you've got to make sure that you take the Word of God and the grace of God and apply it to your life. Okay? Another is, this is not meant to divide people. I'm always struck by the last prayer that Jesus said for the church. It was to be unified. It was not to be divided. I think today there's like 1,000 different denominations in the United States, and that's not even including the Catholics. It's just like you can go on and on. It's like, why do we have so many now? And by the way, there's new ones that turn up from time to time. Where my son lives in Pennsylvania, there's a church that was called the Schwenkenfelder Church. And I thought, well, where did that name come from? And it's actually a denomination. There's about 6 Schwenkenfelder churches in Pennsylvania, one of them in Illinois or someplace, and that's it. You're not going to go to a Schwenkenfelder church in Texas, all right? But that's one of the denominations, and there are, as I said, hundreds, maybe perhaps thousands. And the other is not to condemn. And this is hard to do, because a lot of times that's exactly where we go to. And throughout history, that has been a problem, is condemning people. You don't believe like I believe, and therefore you're wrong. And you're going to go to hell because of it. Have you ever heard that? I mean, I remember a guy we had a big conference, and there was 1,000 people there, and there were women that were up helping to lead service, just like what we had this morning. They're standing up there and they have microphones. And this guy came storming in, and he stood in the middle of this whole church, and he was mad, and he's pointing his finger, and he says, what you're doing is wrong. You shouldn't have women leading the church, and you're all going to hell because of it. And then he turned around and stormed off. We're not going to do that here. All right? Amen, Mickey? So we're not going to do that. And the other one is this. Don't make me repeat myself, says history. We'd want to avoid making some of the same mistakes that have happened in history. So that goes back to the learning of what we see. All right, some expectations. And what I mean on this right here, expectations, is there are a lot of things that I'm going to rely on. And so you're going to hear a lot of these things. You're going to have places that we're going to talk about that you're probably not familiar with. I want to try to make you familiar with it, because a lot of times there's something important about the places. There's going to be dates, and we'll have timelines, and we'll get into that. There's going to be resources that I'll refer to and that I will use, and we'll go through some of that. I want to talk about theology, and I think that's a big part of talking. Where there's going to be terminology. Some of it are 3-letter and 4-letter words. Some of them are Greek words. Some are going to be Latin words. Some are that. I want us to have some fun, but most of all, I want to talk about people. We stand on the shoulders of 2,000 years of Christians. All right? Isn't that fantastic? All right. So, some things I want to avoid. I want to avoid the whole of church history. All right? And you can say amen here if you want, but if you did the whole of church history, this thing would take a couple thousand years, really. But even if you did it in a shortened version, most college level courses will last a semester of 3 hours a week. Sometimes they'll go Church History 1, Church History 2, and you can go on. And we could spend, and this, like one of the resources that I use, he was doing an hour and a half, and he went on for 5 years, of an hour and a half a week. And I've listened to every one of those too, by the way. I want to avoid a final exam. And the reason I'll do that is because it's not over yet. All right. I want to avoid going down rabbit holes, and if I'm doing, raise your hand and say you're heading down a rabbit hole, stop it. All right. There's not going to be any homework assigned. I would like, if you're so inclined, to go do some stuff with afterwards. Be curious. Go ask some questions. Ask me questions. I may not have the answer, but I might say, you need to look to this or listen to this. Or if you're really interested in that, how about this? And the other thing is quizzes. All right? We're going to avoid pop quizzes. All those things happen in class, don't they? So we're going to try to avoid all that. All right. So in our men's study on Thursdays, we've been studying the book of Galatians, and we ran across Galatians 4. And, in my mind is like thinking about this church history stuff. And here we run across Galatians chapter 4. And in verse 4, and we're going to turn over there real quick, and I should have had this marked. And chapter 4, verse 4 says, But when the time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights of son. Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit that calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And since you are a son, God has also made you an heir. That term, the fullness of time, struck me. What was it about that time that made it full? Why didn't he send Jesus after Noah? Or why didn't send Jesus after Moses, after they conquered the promised land? Why didn't he send Jesus, and you can pick your time? Why didn't he send him to our time? Because we weren't ready. I think I mentioned that to somebody, and they said, because we would really screw it up. All right? Humankind's going to screw it up anyway, all right? But we would have really screwed it up today, if you can imagine, with all our technology and information and everything like that. Man, it would be tough to get that message, the message of grace, out to the world. And so you look at that thing and it says, and I'll tell you at the end of it, I don't know, but God did. God had things moving in place, and we can look at them and go, wow. And he still does the same thing today. All right? So there were things socially that were prepared for God, in their society. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and we're going to hit some of that. There was also religious things that were in place. The Jewish religion had reached a point where the anticipation, and we'll see that, we'll talk about the anticipation of the Messiah. And there were also political things in place that really helped out spreading the gospel. All right? In AD 1, and I just picked that day, I couldn't figure out, do you do AD 1 or AD 0 or whatever, and you can get lost in it. The world population was around 225 to 275 million, give or take a few million. We don't know. They estimate that. That's a 50 million range. But still, you look at that, the size of the United States now is greater than that. All right? So you take that, spread the United States all over the world, and you would have had something closer to what we have. 58 million that was in the Han Dynasty, in what we would know as China today, that area of the world. 54 million were in the Roman Empire. Okay? And that's where we're going to spend most of our time talking about that. All right? And then the Parthian dynasty, which today, I switch it off. Okay. Iran today, Iraq, that area like that, had about 20 million. India had around 20 million. Africa, the whole continent of Africa probably had around 20 million. And of course, this map doesn't show it, but the Americas, There were 12 million natives around from Alaska to there wasn't many in the Western continent. Only 12 million. You think about things have changed. All right. The Roman Empire, which we want to talk about in particular, and this was at its greatest. And so you'll see this up here that, that this was at its greatest. So in AD 117, which is when they reached their peak, it ran all the way from Britain, northern Africa, all the way across, down into Egypt, down the Nile River, into the Arabian Peninsula, all the way back over there into what modern day is Syria, Syria today, Iran, Iraq. It's running over that direction, and then obviously all this area up there that we would call Europe, and vast area, 55 million people in that area. All right, and there's a lot that they didn't conquer too. In the middle of all that is Rome. All right, now I want to look at three major contributors to the fullness of time. And the first one is Israel, and then we're going to take a look at Greece, and then the last one we're going to take a look at Rome. And so we're going to take a look at these right now just real briefly, and I am very cognizant of the time, and I've got a real challenge is to cover the material adequately, not too fast, but enough. So, and I want to try to keep it to an hour. I'll just tell you that right now. All right, so what did Israel contribute to the fullness of time? All right, and Israel at that time looked kind of like this on this map. And if you were back in the Roman Empire, the one we looked at before, Israel is way over there, and it says Judea, and that's what they would have called it, was Judea. And it's over there just east of Cyprus, and it's just that little strip, pretty much what you would know as Israel today. Probably a little bit bigger at that time, and we move on from there. And this is the area that you may be familiar with it from reading the Bible. Okay, so what did they contribute? The Scriptures. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about the Scriptures. In this day and time, the language was Greek. They still had local dialects and others, and a lot of people in Israel would have spoken Aramaic. What they didn't speak was Hebrew. All right? Don't get confused with that. They did not speak Hebrew during the time of Jesus. They spoke either the local Aramaic or the language of commerce and everything else, which was Greece. All right? Which was Greek. In particular, Koine Greek. When the Bible refers to the Scriptures, all right, and whether it was Paul or Peter or anybody, they are talking about the Old Testament Scriptures. We talk about the Scriptures, we talk about the whole thing. We talk about the New Testament and the Old Testament all in one big package. All right? They didn't have that. They talked about the Scriptures. And in particular, there was a Greek version of the Scriptures called the Septuagint. And we're going to have a lesson or a class about how we got the Bible and kind of how you know things like that. But the Septuagint, basically, if you believe the stories around it, there were 70 scholars that got together to translate the Hebrew language, the Hebrew law, the Hebrew Old Testament, as we call it, and they were going to translate that into Greek. And so they took these 70 scholars and put them in 70 different places. So they're all by themselves. Each one of them did the translation. They came back, and they were all the same. That's what the tradition has it. Didn't matter. It was accepted. Whether or not that's exactly how it happened, they had the Septuagint. They had this Greek version of the Bible. Now, we have found since then Hebrew manuscripts. Not we. I didn't find any of it. So there's Hebrew manuscripts that have been found, and if you compare the Hebrew with the Greek Septuagint, you might get some things that are a little bit different. And a lot of it just had to do with the wording and how they would have translated it. If I were going to challenge you to translate something into English and you translated it into King James English, I'd look at you kind of funny. Language changes over time. But sometimes in the Bible, you will see things and you'll look at it and they'll say, some manuscript said this or some said that, and it'll refer back to what might have been done in the Septuagint, and it's different than what they found in a document that even went prior to that. So When they talk about the scriptures, that's what they did. That's one of the things that Israel contributed. Another one is the theology of one God. All right? The Shema, the Lord our God is one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. They were fanatical about this too. Their culture at the time was a plurality of gods, 1,000 gods. There was a God for so many things that you couldn't even name all of them if you had to. And so they brought in this theology of one God. There was nobody else that had that. All right. And then the next is religious practices. And the religious practices of what they did, they met in the synagogues, they taught, they sacrificed. There was a lot of things that went into their religion, but that's one of the things that they brought to the table. Another is the dispersion, is that they actually had Jews throughout the Roman Empire. At the time of Christ, they estimated there was probably about 10% of the Roman Empire were Jewish. They weren't all in Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself would have been maybe 1 million people. All right, probably less than that, more like 700, 600,000. So that left 5 million. If there's 55 million in the Roman Empire, 10%, 5.5 million. That left nearly 5 million people all throughout that area of the world. All right, and so there is dispersion, and in all those places, they have synagogues, and they teach, and they practice a religion. So that's going to you see that, going through that, you will see that Paul went to a town, he went to the synagogue. So they gave us that. They had a messianic anticipation too. It had been 400 years since the last prophet had spoken. There had been stuff going on. They had been exiled to Iran, what we'll call Iran today. They lost their identity in a lot of ways. When they came back, Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuilt. There were still prophets speaking. They stopped. God was silent. Did God leave them? It's like, no, I think God is getting them ready. But they had a rich expectation of the Messiah. Was it right? Probably not, because they were expecting a worldly king to come in and save them and basically throw the yoke of the Romans off. It's not what they got. All right. And then the last thing, thank God for this, they gave us Jesus. All right. Don't lose the fact that Israel was God's people. And they gave us Jesus. All right. Jesus was a Jew. He was from the lineage of David. You can read all about that in the history book, if you will. All right, let's move over to Greece. And we'll go through this a little bit quicker. When I originally was preparing this, I was going to spend half of our time right here. And I'm glad I didn't, because I think we got something better. Greece, going back with Alexander the Great, and I get into this kind of stuff and how he conquered and what he did. But he conquered basically the world, Western world. He didn't go as far as what you would see on the Roman Empire, but he went a long ways west. He went all the way to the Indus Valley on the east. He went to India, all right? And that's what he conquered. And he brought in language. He brought in a lot of other things to that. So you're going to see that we get from them science and mathematics. They were educated people. They were educated people. I think their education, if we did our education today and we were half as good as they were, we'd be a lot better off. All right. They brought in architecture, and you're going to see that, and we'll see that throughout history. They brought in theater. Very interesting. That you didn't have theater before these guys. And it's kind of interesting. And they brought in athletics. Now, those are two of the things in our society that we give a lot of homage to. We love our athletes, and some people love the actors and actresses, and we follow Taylor Swift, or we follow, and you can pick your one that's in the pop culture. And that's not me though. I have been in the athletic veneration game. All right. Don't do that anymore. They brought literature, and they have some of the most fantastic books, and I could talk ad infinitum on this and think of this. And they brought us Democrats. Now that's just a joke. All right. They actually brought us democracy. All right. And that form of government And if you read Plato and Plato's Republic, and you're going to get the idea of the democracy. And probably the biggest influence that they had was philosophy. And I really would like to spend, I'm going to see if I can work it in, but really would like to spend some time on especially Plato and Aristotle. But we're going to see how that works out and how they were influenced by them. Throughout history has been influenced by him. And even today, a lot of stuff we have in our culture was influenced by these cats. All right? And so we'll kind of move on from there. Now let's go over to Rome. Similar architect, but they really got the engineering thing down right. All right? Big thing they had was the roads and highways. I mean, you could march an army all the way up to Great Britain. All right? Well, you had to take some boats over, but you could march them all the way up to today Normandy. And you still have roads that you can go into, and they're built from the Roman era. You recognize this place, we'll talk a little bit more about that. They brought us an alphabet and language, and they was particularly Latin. So you're going to change over from Greek to Latin over time. Our languages typically are, and you know, you guys will hear me say, well, there's a Greek word for that. Well, there's also a Latin word for a lot of stuff. And some of the, you even call them, you know, Spanish, French, German, Romantic languages, all right? Because they came from Rome. They brought us the Republicans, all right? So just greaser Democrat, okay, no. They brought us the Republic. But, you know, until the age of the empire, they had a Republican form of government. They had a Senate. They had some other things that were in place. They had a fantastic judicial system. You see that written in the Bible. Paul appealed to Nero, all right? And they brought us the military. And I don't want to understate how strong their military was. Things that we still do today, they perfected, if you will. You did not mess with a Roman legion. There are stories throughout history of where there will be 20,000 in a Roman army that will march to take over a place that would have 100,000 against them. The problem was that 100,000 weren't trained in the discipline of war. And these guys were. And we have something today that we experience, and that's Pax Romana, peace, Roman peace. Now that's a little bit of a misnomer, but that is something that went on, especially during the time of the New Testament. There was peace. There weren't, now not completely, but there were not a lot of wars going on at the time. Wars were not a good thing, but at this time in particular, there was peace. All right, now, so that kind of sets up the fullest of time. Let's talk about church history. And we're doing great. Where do we begin? And let's start with day one, Acts. All right, isn't that where the church started? Was Acts? We'll just go through it day by day if that's all right. All right. In Acts 1, and I'm not going to go read these verses, all right? We could, and we would be better off for it, but I'm not going to do it. But Jesus had promised the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm sure when he promised the Holy Spirit, they didn't have a clue about what he was talking about. All right? But they got together and they were meeting and they were confused, as you can imagine. And they're like, well, what do we do now? We saw Jesus die. We saw him arise. We saw him ascend into heaven. And he told us to wait. He told us to go in town and wait, and he's going to send the Holy Spirit. What does that mean? All right? And I'll tell you right now, they didn't know what it meant. All right? And what happened? The Holy Spirit came on them, and there was a loud noise. And always, whenever there's a tornado that goes through an area, and you'll hear people, and they will say, it sounded like a freight train coming through. Now that always puzzled me, because usually when I hear a freight train coming through, they blast that horn. All right? And I thought, well, wah, you know, and that's not the way it was. But it made that kind of noise. It was so loud, you couldn't hear anything else. We might use a different term today. Sounded like a jet engine. Sounded like a bomb going off. Think of the loudest thing you've ever heard. And it ain't Cowboy Stadium. I can tell you that because I've been there. That's not the loudest. You know, the loudest thing you can hear. And they heard that. And they heard that in Jerusalem. And not just the apostles. The town heard it. All right. And that's it. And then the tongues descended on them like fire. And then they go out and they speak to people in their own language. All right. And then later, you know that Peter preached, and then 3,000 accepted the message and were baptized that day. First church service was Peter preaching. And so you get this and you go like, whew, what a great start. Let's go to day 2. And I love this verse, one of my favorite. The believers devoted themselves to, and this is an important thing not to miss, the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. That's what they started. That's how the first church service started. Or the second one, maybe I should say. Peter preaching was the first one. Now, the reason I say this is important is because you look at this and you say the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Did they get their Bible out and say, well, over here Peter said, and Paul said, and well, Paul wasn't even an apostle yet. And you look at that and you go, no. They did it orally. Or the apostles got together like this, and they live streamed and said, hey, we've got this message. Let me tell you about Jesus. We have some of that recorded too, by the way. All right? They're called the Gospels. And that is where we get that from, is because those were the teachings of Jesus. So when they got together, they took a passage like, pick your passage, John chapter 4, talks about the Samaritan woman. Someone says, let me tell you about the Samaritan woman. And they tell the story of the Samaritan woman. Or maybe John tells somebody else and says, let me talk about this guy that was born blind. All right? And they go through and they tell the stories about people. The center of the stories was always Jesus Christ. All right? So that is what's going on. That's day 2. Ready for day 3? Well, let's skip a little bit. Sometime later, and we don't know, but probably still in this month, let's say, Stephen became the first martyr. All right, and you remember the story, and I love the story. It's a long story, relatively speaking, in the book of Acts. It lasts all of about 2 or 3 pages, and we call that a long story these days. But Stephen became the first martyr for Jesus, and then afterwards, all were scattered, and those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. All right, and so that's important. What did they preach? When they preached the word wherever they went, what were they preaching? Go back up to what happened on days 2. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Now, there was no New Testament at the time. All right? There was no New Testament. There's not going to be a New Testament for centuries. Okay? Now, there are going to be writings, and we're going to talk about some of those, but that's basically the way it started off. These people are going to their places for that. And the rest they say is history. All right. Got to see if you guys are still awake. All right. Now, if you go over to this map, this is the places that are mentioned in, and for those of you that are online, you're going to miss me pointing this out. These are the places that are mentioned in Acts chapter 2 in basically 3 verses, 9, 10, 11. These 3 verses. And we're going to find these places. Rome. What do they speak in Rome? Greek. They probably were speaking Latin too. That would have been a local dialect. Cyrene. This is modern day Ethiopia. Who knows what they're speaking down there? Libya. Egypt. Think they spoke Egyptian still? They spoke Greek, but I bet they had a local dialect. Crete. A bunch of Cretans there, right? In Asia, this is Turkey up here. Phrygia, that's part of Turkey. Cappadocia. I want to go to Cappadocia someday. I don't know if I'm going to do it. Pontus, we're going to see that name again later. And then you go way out east, and you got Media Parthia, Mesopotamia, Elam. Think they spoke Arabic? They probably spoke Medians or whatever. I don't know what the languages were, but you know that they spoke Greek, but they also spoke something else. The reason is because when they went out on the day of Pentecost, that day, they heard them in their own languages, and they were like, how in the world is this guy? What language do you speak, Harold? Californian. Oh. Hey, dude. And so you're going to get something like that. Harold's learned to speak Texan. And you're going to get some things like that. All right. So this is when Stephen was martyred, where did these people go? They went to Rome. They went to Cyrene. They went to Lib, and you can start seeing where they went. They went to all these places. They went back home. They left. And what did they do? They preached the word wherever they went. Now, I had one thing that I listened to, and this lecturer said, if I were betting on the church really making it, Christianity making it, I would not have taken that bet. But there's a difference because God stacked the deck. All right? He had it in place to do this very thing. All right. Now, we're going to move out about 13 years later, AD 49. And there's a Roman historian named Suetonius, and I don't think you can get that on the early Christian writings. Look it up on Wikipedia, and you'll find this. But he reported this, all right, AD 49. How long is that after the day of Pentecost? 16 years, right? Did I do my math right? Yeah, 16 years. And so 16 years later, we move on, and this is what he says in this thing. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, and that being Emperor Claudius, expelled them from Rome. All right, and so a different writer, he's not part of the Bible. This is one of those resources thing you look at. And if we wanted to put it in there, I could, but I don't think it's worth the rest of the read unless you really like Roman history. But Suetonius is saying, at the instigation of Chrestus. Now, you think about what's happened over the last 16 years, and what has happened is, and you know this from reading in the Bible, there is a rift between the Jews and the believers. The Judaizers, they would be called, and then there were the people of the way, people that were Christians if you were in Antioch, and these people are having problems all throughout the Roman Empire. Claudius got tired of it. And all he knew was this was the instigation of Chrestus. He didn't know who Chrestus was. It's obvious that you guys looked at it and said, that was Christ. Something real interesting happens from this, all right? After this, and this is Paul in Acts chapter 18. After this, Paul left Athens. You remember he was at Athens, Mars Hill, and he went to Corinth. You're familiar with Corinth. There's a couple of letters written there. And there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. Now remember where Pontus was? If you guys remember the map, it's way up in Armenia today. All right, way up there next to Russia, basically. Who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Is that just a coincidence that Luke writes this? No. It was there real in time and place. And we meet a wonderful couple. And if, I'd like to meet them at the South Gate whenever we get there. All right. And we'll talk a little bit about that. All right. Pop quiz, Roman style. I'm just kidding. But I'll ask these questions. Who was the first Roman emperor? Okay, if you raise your hand if you got it, say it.
Julius Caesar.
It wasn't Julius Caesar. He was part of a triumvirate, all right? It's a good guess, though, but he was part of a triumvirate. He was not the first Roman emperor. The answers are going to show up later. I didn't do this slide right. His real name was Octavius, but we know him as a whole different name, and we're in the month that was named after him. Augustus, all right? And Augustus, and he reigned for like 40-something years. He was the emperor at the day Christ was born, and That's kind of cool when you think about that. All right. Oh. Anybody got this one? All right. Who was the emperor when Jesus died? You guys don't know your Roman history, I can tell. Yes? All right. We'll come back to the answers because I want to make sure I got it. But anyway, who was the emperor when the church started? Which was not too far after Jesus died. Same guy. All right. Who was the emperor when Paul preached on Mars Hill? No. Who was the emperor when Rome burned? Everybody gets this one. Nero. All right. Everybody got that one. We know that one. All right. Who was the emperor when the Judean revolt began? Mickey?
I know his name.
Same answer as question number 6. Nero. When the Judean revolt began, it was Nero. Different guy finished it off. Who was the emperor when Peter died? Okay. Who was the emperor when Jerusalem was destroyed? AD 70, probably around AD 64. There's something else that happened there.
67.
So who was the emperor? What was in 1967?
No. 86.
AD 67. What happened then?
Well, Roman.
Okay, we're going to come back to that. Who was the emperor when the Apostle John died? And you might get this one. No. There's a cat named Domitian. We're going to go through these. Augustus Caesar, also known as Octavius. He was the first. He was the one when Jesus was born. And Tiberius, all right, was the emperor. He was the second Roman emperor. He was the emperor when Jesus died. Not mentioned in the Bible. He was also the one when the church started because that wasn't too long after Jesus died, right? Claudius was the emperor, all right? Where did you see that name before? Yeah, we just saw it a couple of seconds ago because Claudius is the one that kicked all the Christians out of Rome. Actually, take that back. He kicked all the Jews out of Rome because there was a disruption with Christus. Nero, Vespasian, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And who was it when the Apostle John died? And it was Domitian. We're going to move on. How'd you guys do on your pop quiz? All right. Here are these guys, all right? This is a timeline, and I want to push through a little bit because we're going to starting to run up against something. But anyway, these are these guys. Augustus, Tiberius, this puts them on a timeline. This gives you the years. We don't have these things locked together. Caligula, he was a sociopath, and I mean, he was crazy. All reports are that he was incestuous with his sisters too. Claudius, we talked about him. Nero, after Nero committed suicide, by the way, there were 4 dudes, I call them that. They call it the year of the 4 emperors. Vespasian was one of those. He won basically a civil war. That year, he won a civil war. These other guys didn't make it. So Vespasian was the emperor for 10 years. His son Titus was the one that destroyed Jerusalem. It started with Vespasian, but when Nero died, Vespasian went back to Rome to basically claim to be emperor and fight it out with these other guys. In the meantime, he took a lot of the army with him, so there was a little bit of a lull there. And then when he became emperor, he says, we're taking care of that nonsense out in Judea. And he sent his son Titus. And he was a brutal man. And Domitian, and then, by the way, there's other things. This combines the other things that we just talked about for a visual. Now, let's talk about Nero. I'm going to read this is basically taken from the first persecution under Nero, AD 67, and this is from the Fox Book of Martyrs, and there's, without getting into some of the things like that, the first persecution, and I want to keep his picture up there because this guy's not a good guy. Let me go back to this right here. All right, so that you online can see how ugly this guy is. Nero, by the way, became emperor when he was 16 years old. And if you had a picture in mind of a spoiled, rotten brat that has all the privileges of the emperorship, and a very ambitious mother. That's who Nero's from. All right. The first persecution of the church took place in the year 67 under Nero, the sixth emperor of Rome. This monarch reigned for the space of 5 years with tolerable credit to himself, but then gave way to the greatest extravagancy of temper and to the most atrocious barbarities. Among other diabolical whims, he ordered that the city of Rome should be set on fire, which the order was executed by his officers, guards, and servants. While the imperial city went up in flames, he went up to the tower of Massianus, played on his harp, and sung the song of burning of Troy, and openly declared that he wished the ruin of all things before his death. Besides the noble pile called the Circus, many other palaces and houses were consumed. Thousands and thousands perished in the flames, were smothered in smoke, or buried beneath the ruins. This dreadful conflagration continued 9 days, when Nero, finding that his conduct was greatly blamed and a severe odium cast upon him, determined to lay the whole upon the Christians, at once to excuse himself and have an opportunity of glutting his sight with new cruelties. This occasion was the first persecution, and the barbarities exercised on the Christians were such as even excited the commiseration of the Romans themselves. It even excited that they got sick of it too. Nero even refined on his cruelty and contrived all manner of punishments for the Christians that the most infernal imagination could design. In particular, he had some of them sewed up in skins of wild beasts and then worried by dogs until they died, and others dressed in shirts made with stiff wax, fixed to axle trees and set on fire in his gardens in order to illuminate them for a party. In the course of this, St. Paul was beheaded as befit a Roman citizen, and St. Peter was crucified. To their names may be added Erastus, Chamberlain of Corinth, Aristarchus the Macedonian, and Trophimus, an Ephesian, all converted by Paul, and a fellow laborer with him, Joseph, commonly called Barsabbas, and Ananias, the bishop of Damascus, and each of the 70. And he's talking about the 70 that were sent out. It is logical to assume that Mark was martyred as well, since the narrative of Acts ends so abruptly not long after this. There would be no more writings of Paul or Peter or Luke. So by the time this guy gets going, all right, the New Testament has virtually been written. How long did that take? Not that long. 67 is when the Nero set fire to this, and I love this frame that's showing there. You can boo and hiss anytime you want, because this guy deserves every bit of punishment that God can render on him. Thankfully, he committed suicide. All right. But then we're going to turn to something different. This is the city of Jerusalem. And in the city of Jerusalem, this is what it looked like about this time in the world. All right, because we're going to move forward to AD 70. And I'm going to read you another thing here in just a second. This was the city walls. These were tall, all right? There would have been probably, I think they were saying 500 to 700,000 people live in this. The square miles on this, because we'll put it in mileage terms. They talked about cubits and some other stuff. I can only understand miles. Was about 0.7 square miles. So less than a mile by a mile, less than that. And there were all these people in it. Most of this, as you look at this, when you get to these things, these are little bitty houses, and they were 2-3-story stick houses. All right? Built much like what we would have today. You might have had some that were brick in this upper city that was known as Zion. You had some tombs, and these areas out here largely were uninhabited. These were more like the gardens and some things like that. And then up here on this map, anyway, northwest, I'm not sure exactly where that was, Herod's temple, also the temple the second temple that we're going to talk about, and it was massive. All right. They talk about the blocks of this temple, some of the building blocks that might have been the size of this house. And when you look at the temple wailing wall today, that if you've seen pictures of the thing, Some of those blocks are still there. You've been there. Okay, but are 3 or 4 foot tall, and that was just the foundation. Some of the stuff. The Wailing Wall wasn't part of the temple. It was part of a foundation or support wall back in the area. In this area, and these, by the way, these walls were made for defense, for defensive purposes. And I want to show you another picture. This is the temple here. Now, if you look way down in here, and sorry for the folks online, you're going to see down here is like a door. This was probably 30 stories high. Underneath this thing, and you see these things, these are rooms and things like that. And underneath them is a labyrinth of rooms and things like that, halls and everything else you can imagine that you don't even get to see in here. All right? All that was part of it. When the apostles and Jesus were walking along and they pointed out, and these colonnades over here, that would have been it, that's where Jesus walked, and he's looking up and they're saying, look at this, isn't this magnificent? And Jesus said, what? Tear it down? And he also said that too. All right? There's not going to be one stone left on another. All right. Let's see. Next slide. I want this one up here. AD 70. I want to read this. On the eve of the revolt, the Judean revolt, Jerusalem was a thriving metropolis, serving as a spiritual and political heart of the Jewish people, both in Judea and around the world. By this time, the city had reached its peak in size and population, spanning roughly 450 acres and housing thousands of residents. I mean, they said tens of thousands. Jerusalem's fame spread across the Roman world. Roman author Pliny the Elder called it, quote, by far the most famous city of the East, while the historian Tacitus described it as the capital of the Jews with a temple of enormous reaches. Now you think about it. There's lots of big stuff in the world. This place was impressive. Now in the winter of 69, going into 70 AD, following a pause caused by the succession war in Rome, that was the 4 dudes and Vespasian taking over, the campaign in Judea resumed as the new emperor Vespasian turned loose his army under the command of his son Titus. At least 48,000 troops, including 4 legions and auxiliary forces, were led back into the province, and by spring, this army had encircled Jerusalem, whose population had surged with refugees and Passover pilgrims and was estimated to have 1.1 million people inside those city walls. Inside the city, rival factions led by John of Gischala, Simon Bar Giora, and Eliezer ben Simon fought each other. They were destroying, look at this, inside there. They're destroying food supplies, they're weakening defenses. One tactic that they used against the Roman siege machines was to remove supports and collapse underground tunnels and storage areas beneath the city, thus killing or maiming Roman soldiers and infuriating them in the process. Although the factions eventually united and mounted a fierce resistance, Roman forces breached the city walls and pushed the defenders into the temple precincts. In the summer months, July and August, the Romans finally captured the Temple Mount and destroyed the Second Temple. The rest of Jerusalem soon fell after, with tens of thousands killed, enslaved, and the rest mercilessly executed. The Romans systematically razed the city, leaving only 3 towers of the Herodian citadel and sections of the wall to showcase its former greatness. The Wailing Wall that we see today was not part of the temple proper, but more of a foundation retaining wall. It is all that remains of this once great structure. The destruction of Jerusalem and its temple marked a turning point in Jewish history. With sacrificial worship no longer possible, Judaism underwent a transformation, giving rise to Rabbinic Judaism that we know today, that is centered on the Torah study, acts of loving kindness, and synagogue prayer. The city's fall also contributed to the growing separation between early Christianity and Jerusalem. Christianity, up until this point, was really a Jewish sect, and you look at that, and that's what it was. When Claudius kicked them out of Rome, he kicked the Jews out because there was an insurrection about Christus. A year later, Vespasian and Titus celebrated their victory with a triumphal parade in Rome, parading temple spoils, including a menorah alongside hundreds of captives. Monuments such as the Arch of Titus were erected to commemorate his victory. The Colosseum, everybody knows the Colosseum, was largely funded from the vast treasure looted from the Temple of Jerusalem. You cannot state how bad this was. Of that 1.1 million, many, Jesus warned them and said, when the abomination that causes desolation, you head for the hills. He warned them about that. A lot of them didn't go, though, because he said it's going to be better for, anyway, you can read the warnings about Jesus, and it's just incredible what happened. Most likely, James died there, the brother of Jesus. The Jerusalem church leadership either died or they're expelled. They're not in Jerusalem anymore. All right? Later, about 300,000 kind of came back in and tried to start resettle, and it grew, and we have Israel today that we see things. That's not the end of the story. All right? God doesn't dwell in a temple. Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. All right? This next thing, I'm going to see if I can get through this thing. All right? I did this yesterday, and I was doing it with Kathy, and I literally broke down and started crying. I went through an exercise a couple of nights ago, and I said, I want to see who all is mentioned in the Acts. All right? Completely different. This is the great cloud of witnesses that we start with. And this might be all we say about some of them, but let's do this thing. Rhoda, she was a servant girl that left Peter standing at the gate after he's released to prison and went back and told everybody, Peter's out there. They're like, no, he's not. He's in prison. There he was. How about Rhoda? If your name was written in the book of Acts, wouldn't you like it to be read, acknowledged? Let's talk about the Hall of Fame. Man, this is well beyond that. Agabus, she prophesied. She prophesied a famine that happened. She also prophesied that Paul would be imprisoned, and she bound her hands up and said, this is the way you're going to leave Rome, basically in chains. Ananias of Damascus. How about this guy? He's the one that taught Paul about Jesus. Now, Damascus is way up north from Judea, but he's the one that taught Paul about Jesus. Aristarchus, he was a Macedonian, a Grecian. That's way north Greece, modern day today. He was with Paul in Ephesus, and he was seized by the mob and was beaten for Christ. Barnabas, son of encouragement. What a description. It's a son of encouragement. Cornelius, the centurion of the Italian regiment. He was the first Gentile Christian that we know of. All right. Dorcas, also known as Tabitha. All it says about her is she always doing good and helping the poor. She would have been the lady in the neighborhood that baked cookies and brought them over to you. All right. More. John Mark had a falling out with Paul. He got a second chance. He preached. And anyway, Lydia, she was a seller of purple. Most likely the first believer in Europe. All right. Now, a seller of purple meant the only people that could wear purple was royalty. She had ties somehow with the royal household in Europe. And there she is, and she was the first believer. Stephen, deacon and the first martyr for Christ. Prochorus, he's the deacon charged with looking after the poor, and this was in the Acts, same time that Stephen was stoned. Eutychus, love this guy. He was a youth up on the third story. Fell out of the window while Paul was preaching. All right, fell asleep and fell out of a 3-story window. Philip, he's the evangelist, one of the 7 deacons. And I told Kat I was going to mention him. He had 4 unmarried daughters, and I thought of him. Kat, that's for you. 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. Isn't that amazing? An unnamed Ethiopian eunuch, the first African convert, most likely started the church in Africa. We know the Coptic church today, and they trace their roots back to this guy. Priscilla and Aquila, we've already mentioned them, a husband and wife tent makers. They were kicked out of Rome. They taught Apollo more correctly. And later it says in Romans that they put their lives in danger for me, being Paul, and I'm thankful for them, and so are all the Gentile churches. We owe a lot to Priscilla and Aquila. Guys, I don't know what they did. It doesn't say. But they put their lives in danger for us Gentiles. How about Crispus of Chalcedon? He was the ruler of the Corinthian synagogue, and he was the one that was converted by Paul. When Paul was put on trial, he stood up for him. Damaris, an Athenian woman that heard Paul on Mars Hill. Most of we think about they left. She heard him, she's mentioned, and she believed. Dionysius, also, he's an Athenian judge, and he's a councilman of the city. He was on Mars Hill, and he believed. Gaius, a Roman companion of Paul and his mission, and this is important because Gaius is a very Roman name. And so you look at that and don't know anything about him, all right? Jason of Thessalonica, he was a Jewish convert and a believer. Judas Barsabbas, a leader of Jerusalem church. Lucius, he was the leader of the church in Antioch, where they were first named Christians. I love this guy, Manasseh of Cyprus. Paul and his companions are leaving, and they housed him. And all it says about him is he was a disciple of long standing. Old guys, we got it.
Dan has a question.
Let me finish.
Okay.
Publius of Malta, leading man of the island that later became the bishop of Malta and Athens. Simon Niger, a prophet and teacher of the church in Antioch, most likely a black man, and he's up there in Antioch. Simeon of Jerusalem, the bishop of Jerusalem. Soper, a Berean who ministered along with Paul. Trophimus, the Ephesians, traveled with Paul on his third mission. Tychicus, can I say that, accompanied Paul to Jerusalem to deliver famine relief when they took gifts back down to them. Luke, a physician and historian. We've got his books, guys, or a diary at least. And Theophilus. How much do we owe this guy? He received the gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles and maintained them, and we still have them today. Guys, it's not the instrument. We stand on their shoulders. Next up, in 2 weeks, the Apostolic Church, and we're going to talk about these things. And Ben had a question.
Yeah, he was wondering, so is Paul and Peter killed before the destruction of Jerusalem?
Before. They were killed during the burning of Rome. Basically, or actually the persecution right after the burning of Rome. So they were executed probably about AD 65, someplace in that time when that persecution broke out. Well before they were already gone by Jerusalem. Well, we got our first one done. What did you guys think? Because I was excited about this, and hopefully you can see that. And we stand on some important people's shoulders. And there's more stories to come, folks. So just hang on. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. And we wish God's blessings upon you. Let's close in prayer. God, we love your story. And we thank you so much for seeing that we get it, that we get this story today. We look forward to what we have in the future. We look forward to our place in history. We look forward to the young people that we train. We look forward to the challenges that we hone with each other, Father, as we go through this life. But Father, most of all, we do it for Jesus, and we thank you most of all for his story. And we pray this through his name. Amen. How do I turn it off? All right. Thanks, folks.
Program like Ben. I'm done.
Yeah.